Hello and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Abdalla Nasef, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sebastian Elischer. Dr. Elischer is an associate professor of political science at the University of Florida and an editor of the African Studies Review. His research examines how identities shape and influence democratization and other political dynamics in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's a real pleasure to have you on Security in Context, Dr. Elischer. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So on the 26th of July 2023, General Abdurrahman Chian ousted President Mohamed Bazoum in an apparent coup d'etat in Niger. So how do you explain the coup taking place?
That's a great question. In fact, for most people, this particular coup and the way it unfolded came as a big surprise. Now, it was well known in the years preceding the coup that there were certain sections of the Nigerian armed forces that were not happy with how the war against jihadi terrorist groups was unfolding, and there were indeed some military coup attempts, all of which failed. And one of the reasons, or the major reasons, why these previous coup attempts failed was President Issoufou and his successor, President Bazoum, were well connected within the armed forces. They had the ability to communicate with high-ranking officers about the war and about the difficulties that the country was facing. And so this military coup that now occurred in July was largely driven by personalistic motives by the head of the Presidential Guard, who was about to be removed from his position. And it was well known that he was about to be removed from his position. So this coup was staged due to personalistic motives of the general who is now in charge of the junta. However, it was surprising to see the Nigerian armed forces rallying around him. And if you follow the events that unfolded during the day of July 26, for many hours, it actually wasn't clear if General Chiani would have the support of other units. Ultimately, they came around, but it is surprising to see a coup that's been largely driven by personalistic motives being successful, when in previous years, other military coups driven by other coups more related to military questions failed. So it is true that many observers were concerned about the Presidential Guard and were concerned about civil-military relations. But the particular manner in which the coup came about and the particular motives that led to this coup and that made this coup successful took a lot of people by surprise.
And some argue that France has been exploiting Niger's uranium resources and that the coup was justified for that reason. So what do you think about that statement? And do you think Niger will be the one losing in that equation on the long run, as it's likely to now sell its uranium for less to Russia, and that its French and European Union aid is now cut too?
So France, of course, is and has been heavily involved in the political and economic affairs of her former colonies, and of course, French diplomatic conduct, and military conduct in West Africa has its critics. And having said that, though, there's hardly anything negative that happens for which the French aren't blamed. So it's difficult to find a middle ground here. It's difficult to know which things can be ascribed to the French and which kind of have a domestic origin. With regard to uranium, so Niger is exporting a lot of uranium to France, but Niger is not the only exporter for uranium worldwide. And in fact, countries like Namibia or Canada or Australia are more important providers of uranium. And it would be wrong to say that France is exploiting Niger with regard to uranium. That might have been true in the past. It might have well be true until the 1990s. or beyond then. So a moment in time when France was more dependent on uranium supplies from Niger. This situation on the world market has changed pretty dramatically over the course of the last 20 years. What is true is that France in the past has dictated those export prices that Niger can charge for that uranium. So it is certainly true that this is an unequal relationship between the two. Um, However, my impression is that by not exporting uranium to France anymore, Niger will hurt itself because, as I said before, France no longer relies on Niger for its uranium import. It can import that from other countries, but Niger has very few other countries that would buy that uranium from Niamey. So I do think this will have detrimental effects to Niger, as will be the cut off security aid that now has occurred in the aftermath of this coup, or the unconstitutional removal of President Bazoum. I think Niger is highly aid dependent and has been so since around 2015, so really since the onset of the war against Boko Haram. This will hit Niger hard, especially in combination with those trade sanctions that have been imposed, especially by ECOWAS. Niger is currently not really in a situation in which it is able to export any goods to any of its neighboring countries, and it is not receiving development aid from what used to be her major Western partners. So this is going to have really detrimental economic consequences, largely for the Nigerian population, which we all know lives, the majority of which lives in multidimensional poverty. So as long as this crisis endures, the population of Niger will suffer tremendously.
And what do you make of talks of an ECOWAS military intervention to reinstate constitutional order in Niger? Do you think it's likely and justifiable?
It's a very volatile situation with great uncertainty ahead. ECOWAS has made it very clear that if President Bazoum is not being reinstated, or if we do not see a return to a democratically elected civilian, it plans to intervene militarily in the country. And Niger has responded to that with an equally volatile and aggressive rhetoric, saying that if that was to happen, it would fight ECOWAS, and Niger is currently in the process of securing military support from Mali, Burkina Faso, and maybe also Russia. Um, it is hard to say. So, in its official declaration, of course, ECOWAS is insinuating or openly stating that a date for the military intervention has already been agreed upon. Um, and there have been talks among high ranking military officers of the various militaries that make up ECOWAS. Um, do, a more recent incident where ECOWAS threatened a military intervention and where they would have gone through with it was the aftermath of the 2016 elections in Gambia. So ECOWAS has shown that it can be capable of doing this. At the same time, in the past, we have seen ECOWAS rhetoric that was not matched by reality. And the occupation of Mali's north by jihadi groups in 2012 would be an example where ECOWAS did not did not go the extra mile, did not launch its intervention, even though it planned to do so for half a year or so. A lot is at stake for ECOWAS, especially since the Nigerian coup now comes in the aftermath of many other coups in the region, most notably Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso. And all of these military juntas derive their legitimacy by decrying ECOWAS, by saying this is not a legitimate organization it is an organization that is lecturing us about democracy, but that in fact is run by presidents who've not been democratically elected. ECOWAS knows it cannot really afford to lose another member state to populist military rule. So there is a lot at stake for ECOWAS as an organization and as a feasible player on the world stage. My own impression is precisely because so much is on the line for ECOWAS. The planning that they are doing is real. And what, of course, right now they're doing, they're trying to keep up the pressure because President Bazoum formally has not resigned. So there is a case to be made that he's still the legitimate president of Niger. And ECOWAS is trying to keep that pressure up for as long as they can. As I said before, a lot of uncertainty ahead, but I think ECOWAS is serious because their own future as a serious external player in the region is at stake, given the treatment that ECOWAS has received by the juntas in Conakry, Bamako, and Ouagadougou, and now also in Niamey.
But from the statements I've read by the ECOWAS, it seems as though constitutional order is defined by them as reinstating President Bazoum, while he's held by the Nigerian military. So what if they, execute him? He's already under arrest, so how can that be explained?
So that's the great concern. The concern is so the precise circumstances under which President Bazoum is being held are also fairly unclear. His doctor was allowed to see him, but there are stories about Bazoum not having access to regular electricity and being without appropriate nutrition. It's hard for us to verify that. This indeed is the ECOWAS demand, as you rightly pointed out, that Bazoum will be reinstated. My personal conviction is there would be room for negotiations. So if the junta said, we're not going to reinstate Bazoum, but we're going to resign, and there's going to be an interim civilian leader, and we're going to have new elections in half a year or a year, I think that could be a feasible compromise. But the concern that the junta will execute Bazoum is real. And some people argue, or the junta has threatened that would happen if there was an ECOWAS military intervention. So this is very concerning. This is the kind of crisis that you rarely see in a West African context. This has the potential to escalate into a bloody conflict, including a regional war. That's not something that we've seen in the region since independence from France and the United Kingdom in the 1960s. A very, very concerning situation. The killing of a sitting president really hasn't occurred since, I think, the Rawlings military coup in Ghana in the late 1970s. So, so very, very concerning, very volatile situation emerging.
Definitely. Do you think there is a common factor present among the continuous coups Africa's been witnessing recently? Take into account Gabon's recent coup, which happened last week.
So a couple of comments here. So there are commonalities, but there are also differences. So the commonalities are that all of these military coups have occurred in countries that are highly aid dependent, that are not doing well on the socioeconomic front, and that when I say not doing well, I mean not doing well by regional standards. I'm not using the Western world as a bench line of comparison because that's very problematic in a number of ways. But these countries haven't been doing socioeconomically well by regional standards. These are all countries in which corruption is deeply ingrained, and these are all countries in which statehood is exceptionally weak. So if we look at the coup belt, so the number of countries that have been affected by a successful military coup in the last 3 years, they are stretching from Guinea on the west coast of Africa to Sudan on the east coast of Africa, and it's sort of a line that separates the Maghreb or Northern Africa from the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa. So I think these countries share many things. I think they share the fact that democracy did not deliver on its hidden or implicit developmental promises, and they also suffer from the fact that democracy was never really practiced in earnest. So it democratic norms and procedures in Niger were in place, and I've argued in my work that they were more advanced, slightly more consolidated than in Mali and Burkina Faso, and certainly more than in Guinea or Gabon. But that the question is all of that really all that relevant? So this is what these countries share. I would argue that the trigger or the immediate reasons why these coups occurred differ significantly, and this might be important as we look at the future development of these countries. So we just talked about General Chiani and the personalistic motives that led him to stage this coup. A very similar situation to what has happened in Guinea under Colonel Doumbouya, who was the head of the special forces and who also, the story goes, was about to be removed from his very privileged positions within the Guinean armed forces. In Mali and Burkina Faso, we clearly have a situation in which civilian rulers had rigged elections and in which corruption was highly ingrained in day-to-day political practices in combination with a massive security crisis. So the security crisis in Mali and Burkina Faso is much more detrimental, it's much more homemade, it's much more domestic than it is in Niger. I don't want to downplay the security situation in Niger. It's very serious by all means. But in Burkina Faso and Mali, the military, to a large extent, was motivated also by the security situations that their societies were in. In Gabon, the coup was really motivated by the recent elections that took place and by non-respect to constitutional procedure. Gabon, of course, because of its oil income and because of the fact that it's been governed by the same family for half a century, again, a very different domestic situation than, say, in Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, or Mali. So I would argue there are certain commonalities, certain basic structural factors that made these countries receptive to military interventions. But the precise reason, the coup trigger, if you want to, why these military interfered differed tremendously across these countries. And those immediate reasons why they interfered will shape their ability to get their way. I think the Nigerian army and the Guinean army, precisely because the coup occurred due to personalistic motives, are pretty divided. I mean, Chiani on the day of the coup just about managed to get the armed forces around the goal of removing Bazoum. We will see if they can agree on the road ahead. The same can be said about Doumbouya in Guinea. Very much personalistic motives. He's very much an outsider in the armed forces. That's very different in Mali and Burkina Faso, where the security situation and the fight against the jihadis provides a resource for the junta to rally around support behind their mission. So I would argue that if we look at Niger in a comparative context, the junta might be in a much more volatile situation. The armed forces are probably not all united behind Chiani, and he probably needs to find a way to secure support for what is now the rule by his government. And I think ECOWAS knows this, the West knows this, and this is one reason why they are keeping up pressure on him, because there is this belief or there is this hope then maybe there will be sections within the Nigerian armed forces that will remove him. But right now, there is no evidence of this. But I think this is the thinking behind a lot of what ECOWAS does and what Western countries are doing.
And what do you make of American reluctance to call the coup a coup?
So this is so unfortunately this is not new. Um, this is something that was also evident in the aftermath of the 2013 coup in Egypt, where the Obama administration dragged its feet and didn't call it a coup. That's because essentially they were okay with it. That's different here in Niger. It's not being called a coup because Niger is of huge importance for Western security aid. The United States, but also the European Union, have invested tremendous amounts of money, of infrastructure, and of intellectual military support or strategic military support to Niger precisely because it was the last Western ally in the Sahel. After the military junta in Mali and the military junta in Burkina Faso asked French military troops to leave, a large number of them went to Niger. The Issoufou and the Bazoum administrations were the kind of African leaders that Western countries wanted to see. So, in their foreign policy orientation, but also in their domestic politics, they were close allies of Paris, but also of Washington and Berlin and Rome. They were close collaborators. They received a lot of aid. The United States is having 2 drone bases in Niger. An unknown number of Western soldiers are in the country. And if Niger was to ask Western troops to leave, this really would put the conflict with jihadi terrorist groups in great jeopardy. Um, Europe does not have an interest in this because countries like Niger and Mali are also allies in what the European Union regards as illegal immigration. But really, for the United States, the kind of main and last remaining really loyal ally is on the line here. It's important to notice that the United States does not have to call the coup a coup for foreign aid to stop. And so there have been a lot of briefings going around that Section 7008, which is the respective law, um, is in theory being invoked whenever there has been an unconstitutional removal of a president. That appears to be the case in Niger, but the United States is hiding behind the fact that Bazoum hasn't formally resigned. Countries such as France do not recognize the junta as the legitimate government. This is why the French ambassador hasn't left, even though the military junta has expelled him from the country. And so there is hope now in Washington, D.C., that ECOWAS pressure and Western pressure will bring about a change or some sort of compromise that will allow military aid to continue, that will allow the United States to continue its support for the security forces of Niger, and by extension, to continue its support against jihadi terrorism. Um, I think there have also been indications that the United States might pursue a much more lenient policy toward the junta than France, for example, does. So there is also the potential here that this will divide Western allies with regard to Niger. So France is pursuing a very tough line towards the junta, not recognizing them, making it very clear that they're not pursuing any diplomatic initiatives with them. The United States insinuated that there might be a way forward with the junta that does not jeopardize security cooperation. This will undoubtedly spark a debate about US security assistance in Niger should the junta remain in power. But as I said, the argument that is shining through the U.S. position is do we help these countries? Do we help their populations? Do we help our own security situation if we simply leave and no longer provide resources that whoever is in power in these countries will need? The counter argument is, of course, that one should not support authoritarian governments. Military rule is always authoritarian rule. And the fact that the junta has made it abundantly clear that they do not believe in basic democratic norms and principles. So this will be the debate to follow. At this stage, the United States is trying to add to the pressure that ECOWAS and other countries are putting on Niger.
Any final thoughts you'd like to add?
No, I think this will be an incredibly important area to watch. Really, the future Western approach toward the Sahel is at stake here. Should the junta remain in power and should Bazoum be finally removed, the future will look very dire, both in terms of the region's political future as well as the region's security future. And we are potentially now looking at a larger scale military confrontation, something that's been completely absent from West Africa in its history. So the conflict, the coup, how it unfolded, a fundamentally different coup in terms of the way it unfolded from Mali, Niger, and Guinea, and a very different diplomatic environment, or a very different scenario now unfolding in Niamey than in the other capitals.
Dr. Sebastian Elischer, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a very insightful conversation, and we hope we can keep collaborating in the future.
Thanks. It was a great pleasure being here. I'll hope to talk soon.